She walked into the emergency room at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday in February, and nobody looked twice. That was the point. She was wearing dark jeans, a grey hoodie pulled low, and a field jacket that had seen too many winters to still hold its shape. Her hair was loose, slightly damp from the rain outside, and she moved with the kind of deliberate quiet that civilians sometimes mistake for exhaustion and soldiers recognize immediately as control. She wasn't exhausted. She was present. She was always present. She had trained for years to be exactly that, fully in her body, fully aware of every exit, every person, every object in the room that could be picked up and used as a weapon or a shield, and she had never fully been able to turn it off. She had stopped trying. There is a point in the training cycle when the awareness stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like breathing, and she had crossed that line somewhere in her second year at the Special Forces qualification course, and she had never found her way back to the easy inattention of a civilian life. She was not sure she wanted to. She signed in at the triage desk under her name, Maya Donahue, listed her rank as civilian, because when she was not in uniform, she was a civilian, and she was not in uniform tonight, and her complaint as a hand injury sustained during a training exercise. The triage nurse did not look up from the computer. The waiting room was half full with the specific population of a late-night emergency room in a Northern Virginia suburb, a man with a towel pressed against his forearm, red soaking through in a shape that suggested a kitchen incident, possibly a serrated blade. Two children asleep across plastic chairs with the boneless totality of children who are accustomed to waiting, while a woman, who was almost certainly their mother, sat very upright nearby, watching the doors with the vigilance of someone who had been in waiting rooms before under worse circumstances. A teenager with an ice pack on her knee, a man in his 60s who was breathing with the specific, controlled deliberateness of someone managing chest discomfort and hoping it wasn't what it was. Maya catalogued all of them in the first 4 seconds and then sat in the chair farthest from the automatic doors and looked at her right hand. The hand was bad. She knew it. She had known it the moment she felt the snap during the rope descent exercise 4 hours ago at Fort Belvoir. A wrong angle at the bottom of the rappel, a moment of overcorrection on the landing that she had executed 10,000 times correctly and would execute 10,000 more times correctly, and had executed wrong once, tonight, in the cold February dark, and felt the specific sound that bones make when they communicate something irreversible. She had finished the drill. She had finished all the drills. She had driven herself to the post clinic, found it closed for the night, had assessed the swelling, and decided that whatever was happening in there was more than a bruise and required imaging, and had driven herself here. She was not someone who used sick call unless the alternative was losing functional use of a limb. This qualified. 2 fractures in the metacarpal region was not something you could tape and push through on, not for the kind of work she did. She had tried to calculate whether she could, and had determined she could not, and had made the drive to Fairfax Memorial with her right hand resting in her lap and her left hand on the wheel, and she had not called anyone, because there was no one she would call for this. She was good at many things. Asking for help with physical discomfort was not among them. What she did not expect, what she had not calculated for, had not run any assessment on, had not prepared for in any of the deliberate and systematic ways she prepared for things, was the nurse. Her name was Carmen Reyes, and she had been working the overnight triage shift at Fairfax Memorial for 11 years. She had come to emergency medicine from a background in emergency services. 4 years as an EMT in Fairfax County before the nursing degree, which meant she had spent 4 years responding to calls before she had spent 4 years learning the clinical language for what she was seeing on those calls. And the result was a kind of double vision that she considered one of the most valuable things she had ever developed professionally. She could see the clinical picture, and she could see the human picture at the same time, without the one overwriting the other. She had seen everything in 11 years. Not in the way people say I've seen everything, which usually means I've become accustomed to things that would disturb someone who hadn't seen them. She meant it more specifically. She had seen the full range of what a human body can do to itself and have done to it. Gunshot wounds, overdoses, cardiac events, the specific kind of blunt trauma that results from car accidents on the I-495 at speed, the slow particular devastation of people who had been waiting too long to ask for help, who had let something that was manageable become something that was not, because they were afraid, or because they were proud, or because they did not have anyone to tell them they needed to go. She had seen people arrive at the edge of what the body can sustain in every way that the body can be brought to that edge. She had developed, over those 11 years, a specific skill that no medical school teaches and no residency trains for, the ability to see a patient's story in the first 3 seconds of contact. Not their chart number, not their listed complaint, their story, the way they sit, the way they stand when their name is called, what they do with their eyes when they're in pain, whether they look at the door or the ceiling or their own hands, whether they are performing for the room or whether they have gone somewhere internal and are simply processing from that interior place. She called Maya's name at 12:09 a.m., and Maya stood, and Carmen watched her cross the waiting room. The movement was military. Carmen had grown up with a military uncle and a military cousin still in, and she had learned to read that movement, not as a stereotype, but as a specific physical grammar, the way certain kinds of training modify the body's default relationship with space and effort. Not the performative uprightness that some veterans wore like a second uniform long after leaving the service. This was something deeper. This was the movement of someone for whom physical space was a tactical consideration, who had internalized the calculation of where to be and how to move through it so thoroughly that it was now simply how they moved. She noticed the jacket first, not the jacket itself. The jacket was dark and slightly worn and completely unremarkable, the kind you could find at any surplus store or any thrift shop in the county, deliberately, without distinguishing marks. What Carmen noticed was the patch. It was small and partially hidden by the lapel, but when Maya reached out to take the intake clipboard, reaching with her left hand, Carmen noticed, not the injured right, the lapel shifted and the patch was visible for a moment. The distinctive insignia of the 82nd Airborne. Below it, partially obscured but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at, the shoulder flash of a unit that had been in places and done things that were not fully in the public record. Carmen had grown up in a military family. She had learned to recognize unit patches the way some people learn to recognize car logos or wine labels, not as expertise exactly, but as fluency. She knew what she was looking at. She looked at Maya's right hand, splinted, somewhat improvised, with what appeared to be a rolled piece of cloth and a strip of medical tape that Maya had produced from somewhere. Of course she had medical tape in her bag, Carmen thought. She would have medical tape in her bag, and said, professionally and clearly, that she would be getting her back to a room shortly, that they'd need imaging on that right hand, and that the current wait time was approximately 35 minutes. Then she said, because she was Carmen Reyes, and 11 years had made her very good at reading the moments when the clinical and the human converged. Which unit? Maya looked at her, not with alarm, not with irritation, with a very contained assessment. I'm sorry? Carmen nodded toward the jacket. 82nd patch, under your lapel. She kept her voice neutral and professional, which was not difficult because she was genuinely neutral and professional. This was not an interrogation. This was recognition. A pause. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind Maya's eyes, the recalibration of someone who has been seen slightly more clearly than they intended to be. 3 years, Maya said, which was both an answer and not an answer, which told Carmen something about what kind of person this was, Someone who could simultaneously answer a question and not answer it, could give you a shape without a content. Carmen wrote something on the intake sheet. "Wait here," she said. "I'll be right back." She found Dr. Eliot Marsh at the nurses' station at the end of the main corridor, reviewing charts with the focused detachment of someone who was 3 hours into a 12-hour overnight shift and had found the rhythm of it. Marsh was 51 years old, the chief of trauma at Fairfax Memorial, and he had a way of moving through a hospital that Carmen had always thought looked like controlled forward momentum, like someone who was permanently mid-stride toward the next thing that needed doing, not out of restlessness, but out of a deep and settled sense of what his presence could accomplish. He had been in trauma medicine for 20 years. He had been at Fairfax for 12. He was, by any clinical measure, one of the best trauma surgeons in the greater DC metro region, and he wore that distinction with exactly no visible awareness of it. What almost nobody at Fairfax Memorial knew, what was not in the hospital bio they used for the website, not in the profile that had appeared in a regional medical journal the previous fall, was that before medical school, before his surgical residency, before any of that, Eliot Marsh had been a United States Army combat physician. He had completed his medical training through the Army's Financial Assistance Program, had served as a military doctor for 6 years, and during that service had been assigned to a forward surgical team attached to the 1st Marine Division during the Battle of Fallujah in November and December of 2004. He had spent 4 months inside that city during some of the most intense urban combat American forces had seen since Vietnam. He had worked on a forward surgical team that operated out of a succession of damaged and destroyed buildings in Fallujah's eastern sectors, moving with the front as the battle progressed, working in conditions that would have been considered inadequate by the standards of a field hospital and were in fact often the best available. He had learned things in those 4 months about what the human body can sustain, about what it cannot sustain, about what the difference looks like and feels like and sounds like under your hands, that no classroom had ever come close to teaching him. He did not talk about it. This was not a rule he had made consciously. It was simply that he had returned, had gone back to finish his surgical training, had built a career that required his full attention, and the war had become a room inside him with the door closed, not locked. He did not believe in locking things, but closed, because the room required a kind of emotional attention that he could not sustain in the middle of building a practice and running a trauma department and trying to be present in his actual daily life. He kept the door closed. He kept working. Carmen said, "Dr. Marsh, I have a patient in the waiting room. Hand injury. I think you might want to personally take her." Marsh looked up from the chart. He did this with the specific quality of attention of someone who had learned to hear what was being said beneath what was being said. "What's the injury?" "Probable metacarpal fractures, right hand. She says it happened during a training exercise." A pause. "She's 82nd. I can see the patch. She's trying to keep it covered." Marsh was already putting down the chart. Maya was sitting exactly where Carmen had left her when Marsh came through the waiting room door. She was not looking at her phone. She was not looking at the room. She was looking at her right hand with the specific clinical attention of someone who was conducting their own parallel assessment, not in distress, not performing stoicism, simply doing what she would do in any situation that required analysis, which was analyze it. He watched her for 2 seconds from the doorway. He had known people like this. He had treated people like this in a field surgical unit in Fallujah, in circumstances where there was no time for performance, and the only thing that mattered was what you could do and how fast you could do it. And they all had this quality, this particular relationship with their own physical reality that was neither vanity nor indifference, but something harder and more functional than either. They did not treat their bodies as things that happened to them. They treated their bodies as instruments that required maintenance. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside her, not across from her, which would have been the clinical default, but beside her, which was a different kind of message, and said, "Maya Donahue, I'm Dr. Marsh. I'll be taking care of your hand tonight." He paused. "Can I see it?" She extended her right hand without hesitation. He looked at the improvised splinting. Actually quite competent, the right alignment, the correct level of immobilization, and then looked at the swelling at the base of the ring and middle fingers, the specific pattern of the injury, and understood immediately what had happened. He touched the swelling with the careful precision of someone who had done this in much worse conditions and would never forget how much the pressure matters and in which direction and at what depth. She did not flinch. He noted that she did not flinch. How long ago? 4 hours. "You've been walking around on this for 4 hours?" "I finished the drill first." He looked at her. "What kind of drill?" She looked back at him with the patience of someone who was very good at not answering questions that would require her to be more specific than she wanted to be. "General training, physical." He nodded slowly. He said, "The 80-second patch. How long were you there?" She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, he thought, not deciding, but measuring, deciding how much to give. 3 years, she said, before specialty training. "What specialty?" She looked at him for a moment. 18 Delta, she said, after a beat. He went very still. Special Forces Medical Sergeant, the same MOS, Military Occupational Specialty, that the SF medic attached to his surgical team in Fallujah had held. The medic he still thought about sometimes when he was working in the trauma bay and something happened that reminded him of what it looked like when someone did their job beautifully under impossible conditions. He said, "I served with the 1st Marine Division in Fallujah in 2004. Forward Surgical Team, Eastern Sector." He kept his voice completely level. "We had an Army SF medic attached to our unit for about 8 weeks in late November and December. 18 Delta. She was with a Special Forces team running overwatch and direct action in the Jolan district." Maya was still. "I don't remember everything about those weeks," he said. "I remember quite a lot, actually. But there are things I remember more clearly than others. I remember her. She was attached to us for 8 weeks. And I watched her work, and I have never forgotten what that looked like." He was still examining her hand, still professional, but he was also being very deliberate about this, as if the examination and this conversation were both things he needed to do simultaneously, as if doing one without the other would let something escape. Her name was Donahue. The silence between them lasted 4 seconds. Maya counted them, which was a thing she did. She counted time in situations that required it, not as anxiety, but as orientation, as a way of knowing exactly where she was in a sequence of events that she was managing. She said, "She was my mother." Eliot Marsh stopped moving. He looked at her, not in the clinical sense, not the attending physician look, but with the sudden total presence of someone who has encountered something they have not prepared for, and is not yet sure what to do with it. He looked at her the way you look at something when you understand for the first time what it is. Then he said, quietly, and with the weight of someone who had been carrying a particular name for 22 years, without having anywhere to put it, "She saved 2 of my people, in Jolan." There was a vehicle strike on the northern approach, IED, secondary ambush. We couldn't get a team in. She was already there. She was already working when we got comms established. 2 casualties packaged and called in before any support arrived. One of them would not have made it. I'm certain of that. Maya looked at her splinted hand. The fluorescent light above them hummed slightly. In the waiting room, someone's name was called, and someone stood. "I know about Jolan," she said. "She talked about the surgical team, the army doctor who kept moving the forward position. She said you were the most productive trauma surgeon she'd ever worked alongside." A pause. "She had high standards." "She had the highest standards of anyone I served with," he said. "And I served with a lot of people." He was quiet for a moment. "Then she's gone." It was not quite a question. It was the thing you say when you can see the shape of something but need it confirmed. 2019, Maya said. IED. Helmand Province. 4th deployment. Her voice was level. It was always level. She had made it level over 5 years of practice, over 5 years of saying those words in various combinations to various people who needed to hear them, and she had learned that the level voice was not dishonest. It was not performing something she did not feel. It was simply the way she could speak about it without the speaking becoming something she couldn't finish. She was the senior medic on an ODA team. They were extracting a source. The route was compromised. She got her team out. She did not say, but not herself. He understood that without her saying it. He said, "Tell me her name." Master Sergeant Rachel Donahue. He said the name once, slowly, as if he was making sure it was correctly installed in him, as if he was being careful about it. Then he stood and said, "Let's get your hand properly imaged. I want to take you to the trauma bay. It's quieter, and we have better equipment." The imaging showed exactly what Maya had already known. 2 metacarpal fractures, 4th and 5th, clean breaks with good alignment, which was the best case outcome for this kind of injury, and which meant she was looking at 4 to 6 weeks of recovery and a long period of being extremely careful with her right hand, which was going to be an interesting experience given her work. The attending resident who reviewed the imaging had the expression of someone who expected more reaction from the patient and was consistently not getting it, and Carmen Reyes, who had followed them to the trauma bay to handle intake documentation and had remained there past the point where the documentation strictly required her presence, watched Dr. Marsh explain the fracture pattern to Maya the way he talked to people he genuinely respected, not over them, not around the difficult parts, but level and direct, treating her as someone who could receive information accurately and decide what to do with it. The resident said, "I can prescribe something for pain management." Maya said, "I'll take it." The resident looked surprised. Carmen saw that he had expected a refusal and was recalibrating. But Maya was not performing anything for anyone in this room. She was managing a medical situation, and pain medication was part of managing a medical situation, and she saw no reason to refuse something that would make the next 12 hours more functional. She was practical in the way that people are practical when they have had all the romance systematically extracted from the idea of suffering and replaced with a clear-eyed accounting of what the body actually needs to operate effectively. She would take the medication. She would take it on the correct schedule. She would follow the recovery protocol as closely as her duties permitted. She would not be stupid about it. Marsh sent the resident for the splinting materials and sat down in the chair beside the trauma bay table and was quiet for a moment. He said, "What's your current assignment?" "If you can say," she considered. "I can say where, not what." "Fort Belvoir." He nodded. "Fort Belvoir, in Northern Virginia, which housed a number of units whose work was not public, which told him something without telling him anything specific. Operational tempo? She looked at him sideways, which he thought might be the Maya Donahue version of finding something slightly funny. "Hi," she said. "When did you last take leave?" She thought about it. "July. It's February." "I'm aware of that." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "She was one of the best people I worked alongside in Fallujah, and I have spent 20 years in trauma medicine, which is not a field that lacks for capable people. I want you to know that. I want you to have that from someone who was there." Maya looked at the wall for a moment. The fluorescent light continued its slight hum. Somewhere in the hospital a pager sounded, twice, and went quiet. She said, "She used to say that the SF medic job was the best job in the army because you were never just maintaining soldiers, you were making the mission possible. She said if you did it right, the mission never knew you were there. They just somehow made it home." Marsh said, "That's exactly what she did." "She taught me that," Maya said. "She taught me a lot of things. Some of them were about medicine. Some of them were about what you owe to the people next to you. A pause. All of them were useful. Carmen finished the imaging documentation and started on the discharge paperwork and found herself moving slowly through it, which was not her normal pace. She was a fast and thorough documenter. Years of practice, years of moving from room to room in a busy overnight ER had made her both. But tonight she moved slowly. She told herself it was attention to detail. She told herself she was being thorough. What she was actually doing was staying in the room long enough to witness something she did not often see in 11 years of emergency medicine. She had seen many things in those 11 years. She had seen families reunited in trauma bays. She had seen the specific moment when someone understood that the person they had brought in was going to be all right. She had seen the opposite of that, which was harder to describe and impossible to forget. She had seen gratitude and grief and relief and the specific kind of exhausted anger that comes when someone has been suffering for too long and is finally in a place where something might be done about it. But she had not often seen two people who had both been shaped by the same fire recognize each other across the distance of years and roles, and she thought that was what she was watching now. Not a patient and a physician, not even a daughter and a man who had known her mother. Something more specific than either of those things. Two people who had been made by the same kind of work, in the same kind of places, under the same kind of pressure, finding each other in a hospital in Northern Virginia in the middle of the night because of a hand injury and a patch, and the fact that Carmen Reyes had spent 11 years learning to see the real thing beneath the presenting complaint. She was glad she had called him. She had not been completely certain it was appropriate, and now she was certain it was. Some things are appropriate in ways that are not in any protocol or procedure, and you have to know it when you see it. The splinting took 20 minutes. Marsh did it himself, rather than handing it to the resident, which he would not have explained if anyone had asked, but which felt correct. Maya sat very still through the process, watching his hands with the specific attention of someone cataloging technique, and he had the distinct impression that she was both receiving care and studying the methodology. He said, "Your self-splinting wasn't bad." She said, "I've read the field manual for metacarpal injuries." "Of course you have. I read all the field manuals." He looked up from the splinting. "All of them?" "Most of them," she said. "There are a lot." He finished the splinting and checked the alignment and said it was good and gave her the aftercare instructions, which she did not write down because she had already memorized them, which he could see and chose not to comment on. He wrote the prescription and handed it to her and then said, "I want you to follow up with the orthopedic clinic. On post is fine, but in 2 weeks, don't skip it." She said, "I don't skip follow-ups." "No," he said, "I wouldn't think you do." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the trauma bay after the discharge paperwork was done and Carmen had slipped out to handle the morning handoff and the resident had gone back to the floor. The shift change was starting somewhere in the hospital. The particular quality of sound that a hospital makes at 3 a.m. when one crew is arriving and another is releasing its hold on the night. Marsh said, "I've thought about her over the years. Not constantly, but she comes back." He was not looking at Maya when he said this. He was looking at the middle distance in the way that people look when they are accessing something that requires a specific kind of attention. "I've thought about what she told me that night in Jolan, about the daughter who wanted to follow her in. She said—" He stopped. Then he said it. "She said she hoped you'd be better at leaving than she was." Maya was quiet. "I don't know if you are," he said. "That's not mine to say, but I know that she said it, and I think she meant that she hoped the work wouldn't take from you what it took from her. I don't know if that's possible. I think some of what it takes regardless." He finally looked at her. "But I wanted you to have that, directly from someone who heard her say it. Maya looked at her splintered right hand for a long moment. She said, "She never made it out." She said this not as a tragic statement, but as a factual one, which was how she had learned to say the things that were too large to be tragic about. You made them factual. You made them precise. You said exactly what they were, without the emotion, because the emotion was already everywhere and didn't need to be named. She retired 3 times and re-enlisted 3 times. She said every time she left it the last time, it kept having more to do. "I believe that," Marsh said. "She finished everything she started," Maya said. "That's how she thought about it." "And you?" Maya stood carefully, favoring her right hand. She adjusted her field jacket with her left hand, settled the pack on her left shoulder, and looked at Eliot Marsh with the specific quality of directness that she had. Not aggressive, not soft, but perfectly accurate. The gaze of someone who says exactly what they mean, and nothing else. "I'm still in the middle of mine," she said. He stood with her. He said, "Then we're both carrying it forward." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something he had not expected, something that came out not as a performance and not as a deflection, but as a real thing. A thing she had decided in the last few seconds to give him because he had given her something real. "Thank you for being there." In Jolan, whatever you did in that building, you were part of what kept her working until 2019, 15 more years. I had 15 more years with her because of what you and the people like you did at the forward surgical teams in Fallujah. She paused. "I know that's not why you did it, but it's what it added up to." He had been a trauma physician for 20 years, and he had learned to stay level in the moments that required it. He stayed level now. He said, "That means a great deal." She nodded once and walked out of the trauma bay. Carmen Reyes was at the nurse's station finishing the morning handoff when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Maya, moving toward the exit, with her splintered right hand held slightly away from her body, her jacket back on, her field pack over her left shoulder. She moved exactly as she had when she arrived, the same deliberate quiet, the same complete awareness of the space. But something was fractionally different, and Carmen noticed it the way she noticed most things, which was with the peripheral attention that 11 years of overnight shifts had made automatic. Something released, something very slightly less carried, not softened. Maya Donahue was not a person who softened. That was not her construction, and Carmen would not have wanted it to be, but something eased. Carmen said, "Hey." Maya stopped. "I'm glad you came in," Carmen said. Maya looked at her for a moment, with the level directness of someone who means what they say and listens to what others mean. She said, "Thank you for calling him." "I almost didn't," Carmen said. "I wasn't sure it was the right call." "It was the right call," Maya said. A pause. "She would have liked you. She was good at recognizing people who see what's actually in front of them." Carmen stood in the corridor after Maya walked out and listened to the sound of the exit door and the cold February air that came through it briefly, and she thought about what it means to see what's actually in front of you, which is the thing she had been trying to do for 11 years in emergency medicine, and which is harder than any training prepares you for, because what's actually in front of you is usually more complicated than the presenting complaint. What had been in front of her at 12:09 a.m. was a woman in a grey hoodie with a hand injury and a field jacket with a partially hidden patch. What was actually in front of her was a daughter and a soldier and someone carrying a loss that was 5 years old and still structurally load-bearing, who had walked into a hospital in the middle of the night for an entirely practical reason and had encountered something she had not planned on, something that gave a shape to something that had been shapeless, something that turned a name into a presence, briefly, the way a photograph turns a memory into something you can hold. Eliot Marsh drove home at 7 a.m. and sat in his car in the driveway for a while before going inside. He had not thought about Rachel Donahue in a long time. Not specifically, not with her name. She was part of the landscape of Fallujah, the way everything was part of that landscape, present when you turned toward it, stored below the line of the daily work otherwise. He thought about Jolan. He thought about the northern approach and the vehicle strike and the fact that when his team finally got a clear channel to that sector, there was already someone working, already 2 people packaged, already a medevac request in the system with the precise information it needed, called in correctly, with the kind of professional accuracy that saves the time, that is the margin between alive and not. He thought about the building, the blown-out window on the eastern side, the light in the late afternoon, which was orange and flat, the particular quality of Fallujah light in November that he could still see when he thought about it, that specific color that meant something bad had happened recently, and more might be about to happen, and everyone was working anyway. He thought about a woman telling him about a daughter, quietly, in the particular companionable silence that forms between people who are very good at their jobs and know each other by that quality, in a bombed-out building in a city that was still being contested around them. He had not asked the daughter's name. He had not thought to ask. He had thought about it afterward, wondered what it was, and then let it go, because there was no way to find it, and no reason to look, and the work continued, and was enough to occupy everything. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He wrote on a piece of paper, Master Sergeant Rachel Donahue, 18D, 1st SVOD D, KIA Helmand Province, 2019. He folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept the things that mattered and that had no category. Then he made coffee and went to bed. He slept better than he had in months, which he could not fully explain, except that there is something about a story you thought was lost, reaching its own continuation, that allows the body to set down something it has been holding without quite knowing it was holding it. A story does not need to be finished to bring rest. It needs only to find the hands that can carry the next part. He had been carrying one part for 22 years, without anyone to give it to. Now he had given it. And the daughter was carrying what she had always carried, but she was carrying it with something new in it. That was not nothing. That was not small. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at Fairfax Memorial, addressed to Dr. Eliot Marsh. No return address, no card. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly grainy with the resolution of a camera operating in field conditions under poor light, of a forward surgical team in what was unmistakably a damaged building in Fallujah. Everyone was in gear. Nobody was looking at the camera because someone had called something in the background and all eyes had gone toward it, which meant the photograph had the specific quality of a moment caught rather than posed, which is the only way you catch the truth of what those places looked like, because nobody posed in Fallujah. He was in the photograph. He was 29 years old, and his face was the face of someone who had been going for a long time and knew there was more to go and had made his peace with that. He barely recognized himself, except in the specific set of the shoulders, the forward lean. He recognized the building. He recognized the quality of the blown-out window's light, falling across the floor at the exact angle he remembered. At the far left edge of the frame, partially cut off, a hand resting on the doorframe. A left hand. He noted that it was positioned at the left edge, which was where the northern approach was, which was where she always positioned herself. On the forearm, just visible below the sleeve, the beginning of something inked. A tattoo he had never seen clearly enough to know what it was. He did not know how Maya Donahue had found that photograph. He did not ask. He framed it and put it in his office, and when anyone asked what it was, he said, "A team I served with." And that was true. And it was not everything, but it was what could be said in a hallway to someone who had not been there, and it was enough. Some things are carried a long time before they find the right hands. Maya Donahue drove back to Fort Belvoir in the early morning with her hand in a splint and her mother's name spoken aloud by someone who had been there when it mattered, and the next day she went back to work. She always went back to work. The work was the thing she knew how to do, and the thing her mother had taught her, and the thing that organized everything else. She went back to work, and she kept going, which is the only way forward there is. There is a version of this story that ends in the waiting room. The triage nurse calls the name, the patient crosses the room, the injury is treated and documented and billed, and the door closes, and both people return to the separate lives they came from. That version is the version that happens most nights. It is the version that the system is designed to produce. People arrive with what is wrong. Something is done about what is wrong. They leave. Carmen Reyes had participated in that version of this story approximately 40,000 times in 11 years of overnight emergency nursing. She was good at it. She was fast and thorough and clinically excellent, and she cared about the people she moved through the system with genuine professional commitment that had not eroded in 11 years the way that caring can erode when the system is moving too fast and the nights are too long. But she had also learned, in 11 years, to see the other version, the version where the presenting complaint is real and is also not the whole story, the version where the person who signs in at the triage desk under a civilian name with a hand injury is also someone carrying something that the medical chart has no field for. The version where what is actually wrong is not only the metacarpal fractures, but also 5 years of a loss that had no proper container. And what is needed is not only the splinting and the prescription, but also the specific thing that happens when two people who have been shaped by the same kind of fire recognize that in each other and speak honestly about what they carry. She had learned to see that version. She did not always act on it. Most nights, acting on it was not possible or appropriate or within the scope of what a busy overnight emergency room could accommodate. But some nights, acting on it was the most important thing she could do, and those were the nights she remembered. Those were the 11 years she had spent building toward. She had almost not called Dr. Marsh. She had stood at the nurse's station for 60 seconds with her hand on the phone and thought about whether it was appropriate, whether it was overstepping, whether a patient's military patch on a partially hidden field jacket was enough to justify interrupting the attending trauma chief to take a hand injury in the middle of his overnight shift. She had thought about all of those things for 60 seconds. Then she had picked up the phone. Some decisions are made quickly because the decision is easy. Others are made quickly because the person making them has spent 11 years developing the judgment to know, at a certain depth of certainty, when to act. She had acted, and something that had been unfinished for 22 years in one person and 5 years in another had found the shape it needed. That was medicine, sometimes, not the fractures, not the imaging, the meeting. The resident who had been on with Marsh that night, a second-year named Patel, thoughtful and careful and still building his clinical instincts, asked Marsh the next morning, at the end of the shift, whether the hand injury patient had been someone he knew. He had noticed the way Marsh had handled the intake personally, the way the conversation in the trauma bay had gone long past the clinical requirements. Marsh thought about how to answer that. He thought about it for a moment longer than Patel probably expected. Then he said, "Someone I knew her family." Patel nodded in the way of someone who understands that there is more in that sentence than is being offered and is old enough or considerate enough not to press. Marsh went home. He slept. He came back the next night and the night after that, and the work continued in its particular rhythm, the arrivals, the assessments, the decisions, the outcomes, and he was fully present for all of it in the way he had trained himself to be fully present, and underneath the full presence, settled now in the specific way that something settles when it has been placed correctly, was the knowledge of a name. Master Sergeant Rachel Donahue, Jolan District, Fallujah, November 2004. KIA, Helmand Province, 2019, 4 months before what would have been her 23rd year of service. She had finished everything she started. Her daughter had said so. He believed it. He had seen her work. He had seen the way she moved through an impossible situation with the specific calm of someone who had decided, at a level below decision, that the work would be done and that she would be the one to do it. He had tried to carry that quality forward into his own work for 22 years. He thought he had come close, sometimes. He thought the closest he had come was on the nights when the situation was very bad and there was very little time and there was only the next thing and the next thing after that, and he found something underneath the pressure that held. He thought that was what she had given him, not technique, not protocol. The knowledge that the underneath thing holds when you need it to, if you have done the work. He kept it. He intended to keep it for a long time. At Fort Belvoir, 3 days after the hospital, Sergeant First Class Maya Donahue returned to her team room and was asked by her team sergeant what had happened to her hand. She told him, rope descent, wrong angle at the bottom, 2 metacarpal fractures, properly splinted, recovery timeline 4 to 6 weeks, full functional capability, expected to return within 6 weeks, and possibly sooner, given her recovery rate on prior injuries. He listened to all of this, and then said, "So it's fine." She said, "It's fine." He looked at her for a moment, with the specific attention of someone who has worked alongside a person for long enough to know the difference between fine and fine with something different underneath. He did not ask what was different. He was not that kind of team sergeant. He trusted his people to tell him what he needed to know when he needed to know it. What he thought was that she looked slightly different in a way he couldn't quite locate. Not better, not worse, not softer or harder, but something slightly rebalanced. As if something that had been out of calibration for a while had been corrected. He didn't say any of this. He said, "Get the paperwork filed with medical and stay off that hand." She said, "I know." She sat down at her desk and pulled up the mission folder she had been working through before the injury and put on her headphones and went to work. She always went to work. The work was the inheritance she had not expected and could not imagine refusing. Her mother had left her things: a watch, a set of dog tags, a letter that she had read once and put in the drawer where she kept the things that were too important for anywhere else. And she had left her this: the knowledge that the work continues, that it requires you, that you are capable of it. She kept the letter in the drawer. She kept the knowledge in her hands. She worked. The hand healed in 5 weeks. She was back on full duty in 6. She did not miss a single follow-up appointment.